How much time needs to pass before grave robbing turns into archaeology? If you're opening the grave to make money, you're a grave robber. If you're spending money to open it, you're an archaeologist. But if you open the graves for another purpose, like jewelry you would like to wear, necrophilia or cannibalism, and had to spend money to buy the tools for it, it would still be grave robbing though. I don't know, man. Sometimes I think it's the same distinction between a soldier killing enemy combatants and murder. Just something we made up to put a name on the same tabooed action for grander pursuits. In North America, archaeologists have to be extremely careful with any kind of Native American burial. Nowadays it's more and more common that archaeologists might get a chance to look at a burial, but they put it back in place as best as they can when they're done. So they study the burial but take nothing from it. This is because the living ancestors of these ancient people still like to honor their dead. The vast majority of archaeology undertaken is developer-led, meaning the site is only being dug because it's going to be developed for housing/industry/quarrying, etc. The site is essentially going to be trashed. There is no possibility of putting things back because the site will be built on and the ground irretrievably altered by heavy machinery. Full archaeological excavation is generally seen as a last resort where preservation in situ isn't possible. The idea of excavation for excavation's sake is a bit old-fashioned these days, and most reputable archaeologists would agree that it's better to leave things in the ground as they are rather than disturb them for no reason. In Beijing, when they were digging their public train/subway lines, they found a bunch of prehistoric humans and their artifacts. Today, the stop in question, Wangfujing, composed of objects they found on the site. I found it by accident when I visited over a decade ago. It's nestled into a shopping plaza. Web link. They preserved it and put a glass floor over the sections where they uncovered the remains of an 11th century house and an 18th century theater during construction. Web link. That reminds me of the Corvette Museum in Bowling Green, Kentucky. A sinkhole opened up one night in the middle of the museum and a few of the cars fell in. They were able to save the cars and put in a clear floor over the cavern. Web link. Oh wow, I like this one. That's a really cool way to preserve/display it. A 5-minute museum. Sorry, but this is just one room with a few bones and rocks, found when they excavated for the shopping center. So if you need a 5-minute distraction from shopping, pop in, but don't travel to see it. It's cool, but I can understand that disappointment if you didn't know. I still think it's an awesome way for them to have done it though. That's amazingly cool. We should have more mini museums in random places. There are a lot of museums across America. The ones around my home are white noise to me, but I notice them whenever I travel. Especially if I'm looking for something local to kill time. There's a small museum in Nolan, McDonald County, Missouri, mostly full of old neat stuff people in the area found in their attics and donated. They have a gift shop that sells passport cards as souvenirs because in the 60s the state didn't put some of their towns on the map, hurting their tourism income, so the county got mad, seceded from the Union, and put up "Welcome to McDonald Territory" signs at the borders. It resulted in some media coverage and tourism, which was their entire goal all along. My dad's family is from there, and I'm pretty sure a good chunk of that museum is from my grandparents and great-uncles. The idea of excavation for excavation's sake is a bit old-fashioned these days, and most reputable archaeologists would agree that it's better to leave things in the ground as they are rather than disturb them for no reason. This really only applies to burials or full-scale excavation. Excavation for excavation's sake isn't old-fashioned at all, we just don't disturb more than we need to. Not to be rude, but I think you mean descendants, not ancestors. Nah, the descendants can't do crap. It's the haunting ancestors that can cause the biggest problems. This is the same in Australia. The Aboriginal peoples really don't like it when people dig up their 60,000-year-old relatives from the ground, and rightly so. Both death and land are extremely important in Aboriginal cultures. This is because the living ancestors of these ancient people still like to honor their dead. Well, they have to because of federal laws. However, the laws were written to align with the intention of their living ancestors. So they study the burial but take nothing from it. This is because the living ancestors of these ancient people still like to honor their dead. Not exactly true. They did a dig on my reserve in the 70s. Much of the artifacts were sent to Ottawa. They put all the human remains back. Any tools, fabrics, or pottery, were taken for study. They are slowly getting repatriated back home, which is the upside, I guess. 70s is 50 years ago now, at the very least 40. I would think people would consider that a long time ago. World War II was closer to 1970 than 1970 is to today. Archaeology/anthropology has a long history of unethical practices, this being one of them. An act was passed in 1990, NAGPRA, that is supposed to protect Native American graves and repatriate any remains and artifacts that have been taken for research. Researchers have been struggling to comply with this act for many reasons, mostly because of problems within their own field. Thus, delaying or even dodging repatriation. Source: I have a degree in anthropology. Probably not the most knowledgeable, but I used to be involved in the field. You mean living decedents, otherwise those people are well worth study. Yes, but it's spelled descendants. Yep, a decedent is a deceased person, so a living decedent would be a legal way of describing a zombie? There's also a methodology component to it. Regardless of the age of the remains, if I wobble up with a metal detector, dig a hole and yank out anything of value, that's grave robbing. If I fight for months for planning approval, record every detail of the site in obsessive detail, then refill any holes carefully when the funding has run out even though there's still more to discover, that's archaeology. Plus archaeology's not just graves. That's archaeology. It isn't just digging, he said with distress, meticulous planning you've based on a guess, it isn't just begging for funding anew. He whispered, unhappy, it's paperwork too. I have a Sprague poem of my own. Thank you. Today's been rather crap, so this has made it a damn sight better. I spent 6 weeks on an archaeological dig 2 summers ago and you wouldn't believe the sheer amount of paperwork involved. You could move a single shovel full of dirt without filling out 3 different forms to make sure everything was thoroughly documented. Also noteworthy is that, at least in the UK, there's a requirement to rebury any uncovered human remains. In Canada you can't rebury and walk off, you have to notify authorities. You will get in deep, deep crap for reburying remains without telling anyone, and in the case of Indigenous sites we are legally obligated to notify the affiliated band office so that the remains can be reinterred with proper rights. It also varies from province to province because of the differences in license structure/requirements. Here we have First Nations monitors on most of the digs I've worked on as well. What constitutes grave robbing depends on who's being asked. European graves, generally no one cares if there's no one maintaining them. First Nations on the other hand, care a lot for obvious reasons. The law says that if it's 50 years or younger and the grave isn't marked, it's potentially a crime scene. Regardless, if we find unexpected remains we call the cops, which grave robbers don't do. If we have been hired to dig up graves, the cops already know we're there. Edit to add, unlike pot hunters, we also don't keep or sell things we find. It's a lot more than methodology, it's also, as you allude to, motivation and intent. Grave robbers just want to take stuff for themselves. Archaeologists, in theory, anyway, are there to learn something about the culture that produced whatever artifacts are being examined. Edit, there are still people commenting to remind me that archaeology has a rich history of colonialism, which can make it morally equivalent to, or perhaps worse than, grave robbing. You're not wrong, but I'll point out that this isn't inherent to the field, though it has historically been deeply connected to it. For example, I want to learn what this mass of gold looks like in the British Museum. Hence the caveat in theory, anyway. You're too right that plenty of historical archaeology has been indistinguishable from grave robbing. This is the only proper answer here, and typical of Reddit it's way below. Grave robbing/vandalism/etc. is merely that, repossession of discovered content for reasons such as sale, intentional desecration, etc. Archaeology involves scientific effort, certain standards of methodology, transparency, and everything else that's part of archiving a location of interest. Edit, okay guys, I get it, it's upvoted decently now. And lots of cold wet mud. We used to joke that if work on a site carries on in conditions where only a crazy person would consider sitting in a cold wet hole in the ground, it's archaeology. Source, excavating on the London foreshore, where the window around the tides meant that work happened regardless of the conditions. Weird, We said the same thing about hot wet mud when we excavated a Confederate fort in a North Carolina forest years back. It was the middle of the summer and the heat index was 105 to 110 and the air was basically a humid curtain, but we had to wear long sleeve everything because of wood ticks. Oh, and snakes would slither by pretty casually on a regular basis. So yeah, definitely crazy person conditions. Strange. It's almost as if you have to be a little bit odd to be an archaeologist. Can confirm. My wife always wanted to be an archaeologist, and she's a little bit odd. Come join us doing Near Eastern archaeology. I think I saw it rain once during 5 years of field work in Israel. It's hot and dusty, but at least it's not freaking hot and sandy. I envy not the Egyptologists. We used to joke that if work on a site carries on in conditions where only a crazy person would consider sitting in a cold wet hole in the ground, it's archaeology. Sounds like the military to me. If it ain't rainin', we ain't trainin'. As an archaeologist, I was working on a prehistoric American Indian site not far from where I live that was used as a sort of continuous active site for students at a nearby college. One summer, all the students were assigned different features in the excavation unit. One of the features, a splotch of darker soil, looked really strange. Didn't really resemble any expected shape. Turns out to be a ditch some grave robbers dug filled with old Gatorade bottles and shotgun shells. The ditch ran between two other features, missing them both by mere inches. Both of them were burials. Not too sure if this sounds like grave robbing or several guys trying to hide their shells after shooting Gatorade bottles and inadvertently stumbling upon something. You might be right, but the school has been excavating that site for a few years. Word gets around and apparently people from the town and ask all kinds of really in-depth questions about locations. I guess it's been robbed before, too. Same, my university has a similar site too. My brother, who likes to metal detect and doesn't comply with national park laws, because he is POS, wanted to know where my arch class was digging. Yeah, not a snowball's chance in hell I would ever tell him where it is. Besides, the only thing he'd pick up with that would be square head nails from a house that was built there in the 1830s. But it's all about context. The other college in our town had dug there in the 1970s and some guy was pretty good with working glass. So he effing left behind glass worked into the shapes of arrowheads. Pure tampering with the site. Wow, bit bloody lucky there. On one site I worked on, we were less lucky. A digger driver decided it was easier to excavate a slope between two ground levels rather than create a slope between the levels by infilling with spoil. He dug through a medieval long cist burial. Sharing the results. Putting artifacts in museum and or returning to the descendants. Extra points for the use of wobble lol. I actually had to look this up once for reasons. It's 100 years or when the deceased has no remaining living relatives, whichever comes first. I think there should also be some sort of acknowledged organization involved. If I'm going to do some archaeology and dig up 100-plus-year-old graves at my local graveyard, I'm probably still going to be arrested for grave robbing. Not sure about that. I live right next to a hill that used to be heavily populated in the Bronze Age. People dig stuff all the time. If I recall correctly, the only requirement is to report your findings. Well, but there's a huge difference between 100-year-old graves and graveyards, and remains of the Bronze Age. True, remains of the Bronze Age are probably far more important archaeologically speaking and really should be handled by people with training. Wow, I didn't know there was an actual answer, I just thought it was a funny question laughing out loud. There's an answer for every reasonable question, it's just a matter of if anyone knows to give it to you. The main reason I asked is because I went to an ancient Egyptian exhibit once. There was a mummified body of a pharaoh in there, just sitting without wrappings in a glass case. I found it disturbing to see an actual corpse in a museum exhibit. I mean, would it be okay to have an American president corpse in a museum in 3,000 years? It's a little weird. In Sweden there was some controversy surrounding this museum exhibit recently. An SFW, picture in the link, they ended up being finally cremated and buried a couple of months ago. Edit, the link includes a picture of the preserved babies, so I added a not suitable for work warning. Personally I didn't find it too disturbing, and I'm usually kind of sensitive, but as you see in the comments below, others didn't enjoy it. Your life, your choice. Web link. Is it possible to unsee things? Lenin's corpse would like a word. And of course you need a license so that you aren't just excavating to find some loot. If you're in the United States and find a grave, there is no period of time elapsed when it becomes legal to dig it up and loot the remains. Grave sites are legally protected. If it's a Native American burial, you'd be breaking federal law. You can dig up a grave if you have a reason to, but you most definitely require a permit to do so, and in order to get one you'll likely need an archaeologist or medical examiner, depending on the age of the burial, running the show. The difference between an archaeological site and a modern site is different where you are and depends on local state laws. In Florida, I know it used to be 75 years, but it's possible that's changed. I used to be an archaeologist. I have a degree in the field and worked in it, primarily in the southeastern USA for about 10 years. Yep. You can never dig it up. But you could build an airport runway over it. Web link. We build over grave sites all the time. Lots of Manhattan parks are built over Potter's Fields, for example Madison Square Park, Washington Square Park and Bryant Park. It really depends on where you live. Every country has different laws regarding exhumation. Thank you for watching. If you like our videos, please like them on YouTube. And share them with your friends. Please subscribe to be the first to know about Red Rabbit Reader's new videos. We welcome your comments below. Another of our videos will begin shortly.